here's the thing. Was the Cold War inevitable? And the answer that I would give is no, not inevitable at all, and especially not inevitable in the way that it came. If you go to the end of 1944 and the beginning of 1945, you will find all sorts of indications that the U.S. political system was more favorable to Stalin and the Soviets than to Churchill and the British. And part of it gets in a couple of aspects of a little story tonight. Go back to then and also bear on now. Mm-hmm. Greece is the key element here. You'll remember that Churchill had flown to Moscow in October 1944 and had a conference with Stalin in which they exchanged these percentages. And the percentages, right, this is a very dubious thing, but Churchill says, look, why don't we have 90% Russian predominance in Romania, the British get 90% of Greece, and 50-50 in Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. And Stalin can also have 75% of Bulgaria, right? So they write these on a piece of paper.
It's like a board game.
Stalin puts a check mark. Now, here's what it comes down to. When the German forces retreat from Greece in October 1944, the people who take over are the communist guerrillas, right? Because they're the ones who have been fighting the Nazis. Right. EAMELAS, EAMELAS. So British troops have come in by order of Churchill, and they start restoring the monarchy of the king, George II, I think a Nazi collaborator, and a court full of Nazi collaborators. And Churchill writes an order to the British commander, General Scobie, says, Scobie, you treat Athens like a conquered city where a local rebellion is in progress. And when we get to December 3rd, 1944, there's a rather considerable massacre of communist demonstrators in Athens, shot down by British occupation forces. And at that point, Churchill tries to bring in more troops into Greece, and the U.S., the State Department, and the Pentagon by then, Admiral King, say, look, we're not going to let you use any American transport ships to take your British troops into Athens. So the bottom line of this is, by the end of 1944, Americans hated the British, or distrusted the British more than they did the Russians. This is a completely forgotten episode.
Well, that's quite an amazing,
very powerful.
Quite amazing to hear you say that. Hold on, back in just a couple of minutes. The British were thugs, in my view. Just hate them. Back in a moment. Stay tuned, and we shall continue. Okay, let's get right back to it with Webster. The end of World War II, the dividing up, the percentage game. It was like a big board game. The percentages,
and then the British massacring all these, anti-fascists in Athens, and there was a huge backlash, which these are things you just never hear about anymore. Anyway, here's some little bit of documentation. The British Embassy in Washington sent a cable back to London saying, suspicion of British despotism in Europe is now thoroughly awakened in the United States. Public opinion in the United States has rapidly deteriorated against the British. So Americans are more distrustful of the British than of Russia. So that's one. Now, you may ask, what is actually going on here? With the big three, it's clear that if you have the U.S. and the Soviets and the British are going to be the weak sister. And they are going to be essentially the dynamic of the post-war world. You can see it even today, implicitly, is that the big contradictions are between the British and the Soviets. And the natural thing for the U.S. to do would be to mediate that or to balance it.
Oh, you'd
right?
think, yeah.
And you could say play one off against the other would be a cynical way to say it, but in effect, yes, that too. Now remember, the obsession of the British Foreign Office and the British political life in general is that they balance the others. They had done this for 200 years, right? You become the decisive swing factor it can promote either one coalition or another and play them off and essentially profit from their wars, right? The so-called tertius gaudeins, the third party who stands by and laughs and benefits, right? This is a
That's
well-known concept.
An interesting statement. It's not like Gaudiamus igitur, but it
no,
was
it's
close.
gaudeins. He's enjoying it as a third party. It's the let's you and him fight.
Got it.
And then the third party who can come and pick up the pieces. Now, we had seen this in the Roman Empire, right? We had the first triumvirate, right, Jeff? Let's see if you got your Roman history, right? We have Caesar, Pompey, and L. Crassus, right? The L. Crassus being the guy who was rich.
We used to call him Crassus, but that works.
Then the second triumvirate, more institutionalized, Mark Antony, Octavian, right, the later Augustus, and then there's this guy that you wonder who he is, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus.
No.
So the word was that Churchill had a Lepidus complex. He didn't want to be the third wheel. He didn't want to be the weak sister.
That's funny.
He wanted to be important. And if the other two, if the U.S. and the Soviets had decided to get along, the British Empire would have been rapidly dismantled, and the British would have dwindled to something, much less. The conflict between Russia and the British is probably the deepest in all of world politics. It's thoroughly masked, but that's the whole story of the 19th century, without fail. And then it reasserts itself after World War I. So there's this Lepidus complex, and the asset that Churchill has is Averell Harriman, who happens to be the boyfriend of his daughter-in-law. And what I mean by this is Churchill had an alcoholic son, Randolph Churchill. That guy's wife was Pamela Digby, and she became then the wife of Averell Harriman later on, but his girlfriend already during World War II. So that when you look at Harriman, you're actually looking at a member of the Churchill family. And the role of Harriman is, by this time, Harriman was the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, as we've just covered. And he does everything possible to play the U.S. against the Soviets in the interests of the British. The idea being that if you can engineer a break, if you can get a Cold War, then the British become absolutely vital to the U.S., right? Then they get everything they want because they're indispensable, right? Because otherwise, without them, then you don't really have a position in Europe. So the idea, let's just use one key example. At the end of April 1945, right, 70 years ago, we have the separate surrender and secret surrender of the German forces in Italy by this SS General Karl Wolff, or Wolf. And this is done with Allen Dulles, of course, right? Allen Dulles being pretty much part of the same faction, Wall Street Anglophiles, as Harriman. So Stalin, essentially for Stalin and his group, the separate surrender, in other words, the attempt of the SS in Italy to surrender to the British and the French only, is this nightmare vision, which, there were lots of people yelling that it was time to turn the German forces around and send them back east again, armed and supported by the U.S. and the British against the Soviets, right? Yes, and Patton, right? This criminally irresponsible character shooting his mouth off with this stuff. And, of course, the guy's a reactionary, okay? Huh?
He was murdered, too.
Well, yeah, fine, but I have no sympathy for this guy, because if you're trying to start World War III on the ashes of World War II, right? Let's not make him into a hero. This guy, this was a horrendous proposal to make at the time, right? And he lost any claim to sympathy that I can see. So now, the thing, though, is Roosevelt, by April, he's in Warm Springs, Georgia, right? So he's getting these messages where Harriman says, I want you to send this cable to Stalin, right? And the line is always, you're breaking your commitments, you can't be trusted, I don't like you anymore, all this stuff. And you can see that the last things that Roosevelt did on Earth, I believe actually the last political action that Roosevelt took was he had sent this cable to Harriman where he said, I consider this Italian incident as a minor misunderstanding. And Harriman sends back, I want you to take out the word minor. It's not minor. And Roosevelt sends back, no, you write that it's minor because that's how I want to treat it, right? I do not wish to delete the word minor since it is my desire to make this misunderstanding into a minor incident. So, and then within less than an hour, Roosevelt was dead. So the last thing he did was to try to avoid the Cold War, and he fell in that effort. Now,
interesting. All right, we have to pause. That's a good place to stop. There was a documentary on PBS about Roosevelt. I think the guy who did the Civil War, Civil War
Burns.
documentary, Burns. I think he did it, and it was interesting. They did very diligently sidestep the issue of poisoning. They did mention the Russian artist and the girlfriend were there, and that they got the hell out of Dodge real quick.
And they got out. And also, there was never a moment where the contents of that paint box was looked through.
Never. Nope. All right.
And there's also another person that you haven't mentioned, right? There's Lucy Mercer, the girlfriend. Then there's the Shumatov, the white Russian emigre painter.
Yeah.
And then there's a Russian man who was the photographer who worked for Shumatov, right? Sometimes she would need photographs to use later in filling in different things and so forth. So he was also there. So three of them departed immediately, and that paint box was never examined.
Nobody
and I suppose
stopped
she
them?
threw the paint box into the first river, and that was the end of that.
That's right. All right. We'll be right back with Webster. Okay, back with Webster. All right. Very good. Let's pick it up and carry on.
So as soon as Harriman got the word that Roosevelt was dead, he immediately got in a special, I guess it's a B-17 bomber that had been designed for him as a passenger aircraft. And he set the record, which was going to stand for several years, of the quickest flight from Moscow back to Washington, which in those days it meant going into Africa and then across to Brazil and then up again, or something along those lines, because he wanted to get to Truman and brainwash Truman. And it was easy to brainwash Truman because Truman, of course, had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He had been a member of this corrupt machine. And Harriman swept in and starts telling him that Stalin can't be trusted, that the Russians are attempting to build an empire, that they're seizing various areas. And he successfully goads little Truman, who is terrified and way over his head and kept completely in the dark because Roosevelt didn't trust him and had no reason to trust him. But somehow the party bosses had, with the help of that British spy ring with Roald Dahl, they had made sure that Henry Wallace was out and Truman was in. Now, one of the things they talked about was when Molotov, right, the Soviet foreign minister, was sent by Stalin right after Roosevelt died, right? Harriman got there first by several days, but then when Molotov arrived, there were these acrimonious clashes between Truman and Molotov, and Truman was screaming at Molotov, and this is actually a funny story because Molotov says, "Nobody has ever talked to me like that in my life." And this is coming from somebody who had clashes with Hitler and Ribbentrop. So this was heavy-duty stuff. Now, Poland, this is the issue. And we can compare, we've already mentioned Greece, right, that the British essentially raped Greece in the 1940s. They installed this, essentially fascist monarchical government and got themselves very much hated in the United States, as we've seen. Then there's Poland. Now, here's the problem with Poland. Churchill, of course, had stalled the cross-channel invasion. Right? It could have been done in some form in 1942. No, says Churchill, got to go to North Africa. Could have been done in 1943 with a better chance for success. No, said Churchill, got to go to Italy, and he actually wanted to go into the Balkans, right, the soft underbelly, as he called it. So we then have the June 1944 Normandy invasion, by which time the Red Army has already come quite far west. So Churchill wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He wanted to bleed the Soviets white and find a way to prevent them from coming further west. And of course you couldn't do it. So by the time you get to 1944 and 45, you've got two Polish governments in exile. One is a group of Soviet puppets. They're called the Lublin Poles because the Soviets set them up in Lublin very early on, as soon as they liberate the area. And then there's also the London Polish government. Now, the London government is interesting because it had been led by General Sikorsky, right, as in the helicopter family.
Well, they fought in the war. They had quite a few fighters.
They did, but Sikorsky was then assassinated when his plane crashed,
oddly enough,
in 1943, taking off from Gibraltar.
Lots of murders.
And the prime suspect was Churchill, because it's the idea that this guy was a strong nationalist with a certain base. He was too strong to simply take orders from Churchill, which is what Churchill wanted, and therefore he was liquidated, right? The current Polish foreign minister is Sikorsky, and that guy's wife is Anne Applebaum, who writes in the Washington Post, and she's, of course, a raving Russophobe. So, what do you do with this situation, right? The fact is the Soviet Red Army has liberated the country, and they hold it, right? So that's an important limit on what you want to do. Now, let me just quote what Roosevelt said about this, and I urge you, think about Poland then, to be sure, but think about Ukraine now.
Coming up on 5 minutes, Webster, just so you know.
In 1943, Roosevelt wrote, "As far as Poland is concerned, the important thing is to set it up in a way that will help maintain the peace of the world." How about that? Do the best you can for Poland. And he says, Roosevelt later on writes to one of his military advisors, "The deal I'm getting from Stalin is the best I can do for Poland at this time." And, of course, there are indignant public Polish representatives come to the White House and say, "You've got to free us from the Soviets." And Roosevelt would always say, "Well, you know, we just had World War II, and in order to do what you're recommending, we'd have to have World War III, and I will not do it." We also have to remember that Poland was the first country to make a treaty with Hitler. This was the German-Polish agreement, right, friendship treaty of 1934. And the Polish government in those days were the colonels who had taken power sort of as Marshal Pilsudski faded away and died. You had a group of colonels, and one of them is this guy, Colonel Beck, who then became the foreign minister. And Beck, of course, Poland took part in the partition of Czechoslovakia, right? When Hitler grabbed the Sudetenland and then later Prague, the Poles got a piece of it. So they are, not, those without sin who can then start complaining. And I'm afraid if you look at the view coming from this guy Tusk, Tusk, Donald Tusk, he's currently the president of the European Commission, you can find a kind of hothead mentality which is absolutely unrealistic and which is always, again, ready to fight to the last American in attempting to rescue Poland from the consequences of their own very unwise policies. If you remember those Kaczynski twins, that was a real manifestation of unrealistic and utopian thinking. Anyway, let's just get down to the end of it. It all comes to a head at the United Nations conference in San Francisco in the spring and the summer of 1945. And Harriman makes sure he goes there because he wants to brief the press. He wants to start the Cold War, which he's able to do. And the interesting commentary on this comes from Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann was a columnist, and
for many years,
he was president. He was quite a famous guy, and he says Walter Lippmann was writing at the time, unfortunately only privately, not in his column. He said, "Look, the setup that Roosevelt thought he had created was Stalin would enter the war against Japan, which was done. to allow free elections in Eastern Europe, probably not done, and to accept the American formula for a United Nations resting on a great power veto and spheres of influence. So the idea would be you need to grant Russia a sphere of influence, right? And that includes Finland, Austria, Poland, maybe not today, but certainly Ukraine today, right? Poland then, Ukraine now.
Well, we're sending 600 paratroopers to Ukraine by the end of this week. 300 plus.
We demand that they be brought back. We say not one penny and not one GI.
Baby Cameron is sending 250 UK Special Forces trainers
to
Ukraine.
Again, that's typical, right? Those are just token. But look, Lippmann writes, there's a far deeper conflict of interest between the British and the Soviets than between Washington and Moscow. And he says, we needed to be the moderating power holding the balance of power. And instead, the United States has allowed itself to be pushed by the British into the position of chief protagonist of the anti-Soviet position. And you can look at that today. Who's clashing, right? Who's clashing in Ukraine? It's essentially British networks in Poland and Western Ukraine compared to Soviet networks. The United States could pull back, let them fight, and mediate the situation. Right. And the last word from Lippmann, none of this would have happened if Roosevelt were alive. This was a complete overturning of Roosevelt's policy. And that's then what, that's the fruit of this, the death of Roosevelt.
It amazes me how Truman kind of skated on all this in the history books. He's not held to the fire at all. History has kind of
in particular the Oliver Stone book with he's got a historian who writes with him, but they also they whitewash Truman to a remarkable extent.
Correct.
But look, the other thing is, if we just have one more minute, there was a meeting of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and they invited Paul Craig Roberts, and I'm afraid this was a very unfortunate speech by Paul Craig Roberts. Right? Paul Craig Roberts is an incurable pessimist. He has no organizing perspective. I think he's probably feeling very guilty for imposing supply-side Reaganomics and helping to destroy the U.S. economy. But he gave a speech in Moscow called The Neoconservative Threat to the World Order. And in the course of this, he says that the current U.S. Political setup is such that there will be no opposition. There will be no self-correcting tendency that will emerge from inside the country. In other words, all is lost. And if you remember, Paul Craig Roberts, he said he was quitting writing in 2010.
Yeah,
He's got books called How the Economy Was Lost, How the Nation Was Lost. He's got one in German on Economy in the Abyss. This is pure pessimism, and I don't find any positive proposals. So I think,
well, if you go to his site and you see that photo of him standing juxtaposed in front of one of our founding fathers, I don't know who it is, trying to strike a very dignified pose. To me, that kind of speaks loudly. I think he's a terrible pessimist, and I'm concerned that he's telling the Russians something that's much more pessimistic than it needs to be, because there is now a move to form the American Committee for East-West Accord by Stephen Cohen, Katrina vanden Heuvel, John Mearsheimer, and others. And I urge everybody, get in touch with me, and we'll make this happen. Thank you, Webster. Always.
Okay.
Wonderful walk through a lot of very strange...
Down the Yalta Lane.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Happy March. Talk to you in April. You
Bye-bye. See you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.